Number 1.
Terri Reyes and Shunte Coleman both vanished in Jacksonville, Texas during 2006. Terri, who was 38 years old at the time, vanished on May 21, 2006. Shunte, who was 26, vanished about a month and a half later, on July 2, 2006. Both women had associations with a Jacksonville police officer named Larry Pugh, pictured below. In 2005, Pugh was indicted on 5 counts of violation of civil rights after he was accused of sexually assaulting a woman while on duty. Additionally, numerous other women reported Pugh for sexual assault between 2005 and 2006. Both Terri and Shunte were scheduled to testify against Pugh in court. They both vanished while Pugh was out on bond while awaiting trial. After Shunte vanished, many began to speculate that her disappearance and Terri's disappearance were connected to Pugh. At the time, police denied this and stated that there was no evidence that their disappearances were connected in any way. However, about a month after Shunte's disappearance, in August 2006, Pugh was arrested yet again for assaulting another woman, who was also scheduled to testify as a witness in his case. He later admitted to putting a belt around the woman's neck and attempting to drag her to his van. The belt broke, and the woman was able to run to nearby friend's house. Pugh was subsequently charged with retaliation against a witness. On March 1, 2007, Pugh was sentenced to 12 years in prison for the initial federal charges. Meanwhile, Terri and Shunte remained missing. A few months later, in June 2007, hunters found human remains in a wooded area in San Augustine County. Those remains were later identified as that of Terri Reyes. Her death was classified as homicide. Pugh still remains the prime suspect in her case. Years later, in March 2014, another set of human remains were found in a wooded area of San Augustine County not far from the spot where Terri's remains were found. A few months later, forensic testing confirmed that the remains belonged to Shunte Coleman. Her death was also classified as a homicide. The murders of both Terri and Shunte have only one prime suspect to this day: Larry Pugh. In 2018, Larry Pugh finished his federal prison sentence. He has still not been charged with anything related to Terri and Shunte's cases. Pugh eventually moved to Nacogdoches County, Texas. Other residents in the county expressed concerns about Pugh living in their community. In 2019, a post began circulating on social media about Pugh being a serial killer and rapist. At that time, the Nacogdoches County Sheriff's Office announced that, despite the accusations against Pugh, he was not a convicted murderer, nor was he even a registered sex offender. Although he was indicted on federal charges after being accused of sexually assaulting a woman while on duty back in 2005, he was not actually charged with sexual assault. He was only charged on counts of violation of civil rights. Pugh was later arrested again during early 2020. This time, he was charged with making a false declaration in federal court relating to his 2006 charges of retaliating against a witness. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison for those charges in July 2020. Pugh remains incarcerated, and he also remains the prime suspect for the murders of both Terri Reyes and Shunte Coleman. Still, no charges have ever been filed in either one of their cases.
Number 2.
Whether she was hamming it up for the camera or out dancing with the girls, Anita Knutson was the kind of person almost everyone liked having around. Anita was the coolest girl. Everybody at school loved her. "I was really lucky to have her as my sister," said Anna Knutson, Anita's younger sister. When she was just a baby, Anita was taken in by Gordon and Sharon Knutson, and her adoptive siblings Daniel and Anna soon followed. At only 18, Anita was living on her own, working 2 jobs, and putting herself through college at Minot State University in Minot, North Dakota. Many people wanted to be close to Anita. Until someone got too close. Monday, June 4, 2007, no one has heard from the normally sociable college student in days. "I talked to her Friday," said Anita's mother Sharon. "She said she was going home. That was the last time I talked to her." The next day, Anita stays home from her job at a local hotel. "I called her Saturday just out of habit of calling her every day, almost, and she didn't answer," said Sharon. "So I called Sunday, no answer Sunday, and so Monday I called her, and still no answer, and she should have been answering her phone. After that, Sharon asked her husband to drive out to Anita's apartment to check on her. I went and knocked on the door, didn't answer, and her car was there, said Gordon. Gordon tries to let himself in, but the door is locked. So I went to the apartment manager and said that I wanted her to open the door. First she said she couldn't do that because she could get in trouble. And I said, well, I think you'll get in trouble if you don't. That's when the manager's boyfriend, the maintenance man, showed Gordon a sliced window screen he found in the yard, the screen to Anita's bedroom window. They go to where the window was, and I seen somebody laying in there, and I walked over and the window is open, and I touched her head and I said, you get that door open right now, said Gordon. Inside the apartment, no signs anything sinister happened until they get to Anita's bedroom. The mattress was soaked with blood. She was covered up with a large house coat. She was laying face down on the bed, said Gordon. I touched her, and her body was cold. So I knew she was dead, and from that point I think I was just in total shock. It's in that state of shock that Gordon has to give the rest of his family the news. Police arrive a short time later and begin scouring the crime scene. According to the forensics crime lab, said that she was killed on Sunday morning, said Mino Daily News reporter Kim Fundingsland. It was with a pocket knife, a 3 or 4 inch blade, I would suspect, multiple stab wounds to the chest. In what seems like a stroke of luck, investigators actually find the murder weapon, a cheap novelty pocket knife, at the foot of Anita's bed. But the motive for her murder is much more elusive. Police said there were no signs of a robbery or a sexual assault. Was it a random crime, or was this a targeted killing? To get answers, police start looking at the people closest to Anita, and few seem to stick closer than that her high school senior prom date Tyler Schmaltz. In fact, to find him, detectives don't have to look any farther than just outside the taped-off crime scene. It was just a one-time thing, but according to some people, Tyler stayed a little too close after prom, even moving into Anita's apartment complex after high school. And after her death, Tyler only got closer, creating a Facebook page in her honor and creating a 20-minute-long tribute video to Anita on YouTube. She was my best friend back in high school and the beginning years of college, said Tyler Schmaltz. We went to high school together, we went to our senior prom together. Not dating. I just had a crush on her, said Tyler. We were just friends. Police interviewed me the very second I got up there, said Tyler. When they first interviewed me, it was actually at the crime scene, in the van. They were concerned because I knew exactly when I last talked to her. They kept asking me about that, but that's because when I got up there the first person I saw was her aunt. And her aunt asked me when the last time I talked to her, so I went on my computer and checked my chat logs. They just kept hounding me on that. But then they just asked general questions. A month later, police brought him in again. They were interviewing everybody in the apartment complex including me and my brother, who lived with me, said Tyler. They took DNA samples from all of us. The results of those tests were never made public, but authorities say they never made a match to any DNA found at the scene, and Tyler claims he was cleared as a suspect. She was just so amazing, she just meant that much to me, said Tyler. Back in my first days of college, all my high school friends moved away, and she was my only friend I had then. I'm a quiet, shy guy and I'm not that much outgoing, so at that time she was my only friend. She was just the most amazing person in the world, and she didn't deserve any of this. Shortly after news of the murder breaks, a witness tells police he saw a man running away from the area around the time Anita was supposedly murdered. Investigators release a sketch of the suspect and almost immediately get a hit. That person came forward right away as soon as he saw the drawing was published and resembled him. He came forward and was cleared immediately, said reporter Kim Fundingsland. It turned out he was just a jogger out on his normal route at his normal time. There was some maintenance men working on a building nearby doing roofing, temporary workers in the area doing roofing, that left. It was thought that perhaps one of those people could have been involved in that, said Fundingsland. But police questioned those men as well, and no one was charged. The only thing that comes to mind is the janitor who had access because he was the maintenance man on the apartment complex and he was dating the supervisor of that complex, said Tyler. Anita's dad, Gordon, says he was the man who found the screen to Anita's bedroom window. And in a tragic twist some might consider suspicious, the man reportedly killed himself roughly a year after Anita's murder. But Mino police have said they questioned him thoroughly and don't believe he had anything to do with it. Investigators did have another person in their sights, someone physically closer to Anita than almost anyone else, and she just happened to be one of the few people Anita had anything bad to say about. She had a girl roommate and they didn't get along, said Anita's mother, Sharon. That person was not a safe person. She would have male friends over, and then Anita would tell me she would leave the male friends there, whoever they might be. According to Anita, on her cell phone, this roommate person would text to her threatening letters, said Sharon. Anita was scared of her. She was planning on moving out. As police looked into every possible motive for Anita's murder, her family would be hit with another horrible tragedy. Reports were that Anita and her roommate fought over almost everything. Police say at least one of those fights actually turned physical when the roommate slammed Anita's foot in a door. Anita's mom even says that after receiving numerous threatening texts from the roommate, her daughter said she was afraid for her life. The day of the funeral, this roommate's mother came to me and was very upset because the police had requested that this roommate go down to the police station that day, said Sharon. But what police found was that the roommate had a solid alibi. She'd been staying with her parents on the other side of town the entire weekend. Police still took DNA swabs from the girl, but had nothing to hold her further. Anita's father also says that at the time of her death, Anita and the roommate had patched things up, though he does wonder about another possible connection. The person Anita was thinking of moving in with when things were at their worst in the apartment. And I said, "You're not going to move in with so-and-so?" And she said no. She says, "I wouldn't move in there anyway because of her husband," said Gordon. If he was hitting on her, she didn't go for that. She would have probably said she was going to tell her friend. The family passes that info and multiple other leads on to investigators, and tips roll in regularly from the public. But even with the actual murder weapon in custody, the case goes cold. Anita's family tries to move on with life, but Anita's adopted brother Daniel can't cope with the loss. I talked to him the day before he committed suicide, and he was fine, and he said he'd talk to me later, and then the next day, he was gone, said Sharon. He shot himself. We tried to set up an interview with Mino police, but they initially declined the request, citing scheduling conflicts. Local reporter Kim Fundingsland, close to the investigation, was able to offer the inside scoop. "I don't know if they've dropped the ball, and I don't know if they've interviewed everyone they should interview," said Fundingsland. "I think police have their work to do, and you never know for sure what they've done behind the scenes." After again reaching out to Mino police, we got them to sit down in front of our cameras. "I know the Mino Police Department has taken criticism from family members, friends of Anita's, the community," said Mino Police Detective Sergeant David Goodman. "People don't like to see crimes like this go unsolved. We understand that. We're sorry for that. And we really wish that we could come up with the answers for the family. We recovered DNA evidence from the crime scene in general, including the knife," said Ward County Sheriff's Chief Deputy Robert Bernard. "Nearly everyone that we interviewed submitted to a DNA sample, and all those samples have been compared to the DNA collected from the crime scene. In addition to what they say has been thorough evidence collection, police tell us they questioned as many people as they could find. We talked with workers from the apartment complex prior to the homicide," said Bernard. "A construction company had been doing some work on the building. I don't know if we got all those guys or not. I hope that we did, but it wouldn't surprise me that there might have been a few that we did not interview. Anita liked to go to a dance club downtown. We went through their list of customers, patrons, with a fine-tooth comb," said Goodman. "We were not able to locate anything that led us in any promising direction." Police assert the case is still very much open and even provided Crime Watch Daily with new details. "The window leading into Anita's bedroom had a screen on it that was cut. And I believe that was something done after the fact," said Goodman. "There was some blood found on the cut of the screen, which certainly leads me to believe that it was done after the fact. I believe the purpose would be to mislead law enforcement, to try and show that this is possibly an entry point," said Det. Goodman. "But why? And how did they get in if not through the window?" The main door was locked, so I believe that whoever committed the murder either locked the door on their way out, or if it was locked when they arrived, they would have to had some way to get in, such as a key," said Goodman. And the list of people who had keys to the apartment is a short one. Is the roommate still a suspect? Crime Watch Daily producers have made an attempt to locate and speak to the girl, but have so far received no response. "I don't know that we really ever discounted any of the suspects that we came up with," said Goodman. "Everybody, until we get new direction in this case, is still somebody that could possibly be involved." Police say new scientific advances may be getting them closer to finding that somebody than ever before. "We have been in contact with the State Crime Lab, and since 2007 there's been advances in technology, so they are taking another look at their DNA in that case," said Mino Police Captain John Klug. "I think now enough time has passed that if we try to run DNA on that knife again, that there could potentially be something found." For now, in addition to the police effort, Anita's one-time prom date, Tyler, continues to work his own citizen investigation, which has yielded some very interesting results. "I just received a new tip today that I haven't gave to them yet," said Tyler Schmaltz. "Some random person contacted me on Facebook, saying that this one person told her that this sex offender who's been in and out of prison, someone at a party told her that he's the one who killed Anita." Crime Watch Daily has not yet been able to verify whether or not police have followed up on that tip, but they assure us they continue to chase down every lead they receive. If you have any information about the murder of Anita Knutson, call the Mino Police Department at 701-852-0111.
Number 3.
Brittany McGlone was only 19 years old when she was brutally murdered in Winsboro, Texas on May 4, 2007. Brittany was killed at her boyfriend's family's house. She reportedly spent the previous evening working an overnight shift at Lowe's distribution center. According to her family, Brittany usually went back to her own home after working an overnight shift, but on this day, she opted to go straight to her boyfriend's house. It is believed that she arrived at her boyfriend's house around 7 a.m. and went to sleep in his bed shortly thereafter. Brittany's boyfriend and his family members left the house while she was sleeping. When Brittany's boyfriend returned that afternoon, he found a gruesome scene. Brittany had been savagely murdered. Investigators later determined that Brittany had been sexually assaulted and beaten at some point between 8:30 a.m. and 3:30 p.m. An autopsy ruled that she had died from massive head trauma. The Wood County Sheriff's Department inevitably looked at Brittany's boyfriend and his family members when they began investigating her murder, and all of them were eventually cleared. All had solid alibis that were confirmed through both surveillance and cell phone pings. Brittany's family members actually had another suspect in mind. A man named Chad Carr. Chad was dating Brittany's boyfriend's sister at the time of the murder. He also has quite a lengthy criminal record with prior charges for burglary, sexual assault, and assault with a deadly weapon. Chad has reportedly been investigated, but he has not been charged with anything related to the case. To this day, no one else has been labeled as a suspect or person of interest. In the years that have passed since the murder, Brittany's family members have grown increasingly more frustrated with the investigators from Wood County Sheriff's Department. Various people have stated that the crime scene was mishandled and was possibly contaminated by law enforcement. In 2010, Brittany's sister Hope McGlone posted the following to a forum discussion about Brittany's case. "DNA results came back and we were told no one, but Brittany's DNA was found. We were told whoever killed her was wrapped in sarin wrap. I don't know how that's possible." In 2019, Hope wrote to Wood County Monitor to express her family's frustrations about the lack of communication from investigators. She wrote that she and her family members feel that Brittany has been forgotten and that the investigators lack sensitivity when family members reach out to inquire about the case. A petition has been started in hopes of encouraging investigators to make the case active again. If you are interested in signing the petition, please view it here. If you have any information that could help solve Brittany's case, please call 903-763-2274 to submit an anonymous tip.
Number 4.
When we usually talk about unsolved murders, we're thinking about the perpetrator, the unknown suspect that's still out there, awaiting justice. But every now and then, police uncover a story that is almost too chilling to be true, a story that makes you wonder if we ever know the full story. This is one of those cases that perplexes and terrifies you to the bone. In this case, we know the name and the identity of the killer, but the victims remain a mystery. This is the story of Israel Keyes. Israel Keyes was born in Richmond, Utah, on January 7, 1978. Richmond is a small town of about 2,000 people, most notable for its Pepperidge Farm factory that produces goldfish crackers. It's also known for being quite strong in the Mormon faith, a handful of its citizens going on to represent the faith of the LDS Church and its leadership. The cult classic movie Napoleon Dynamite even shot some scenes in Richmond, which helped add to its small-town feel. But, unfortunately, for a lot of people, Richmond will be known as the birthplace of what investigators would call the most meticulous serial killer of all time. Born to a larger Mormon family, Israel had many sisters. He was just one of 10 children born to his parents, and they were an incredibly religious household. Israel was homeschooled by his parents, who undoubtedly tried to shelter their religious household from outside influences. Many people have tried to theorize how this sheltered, religious upbringing could have shaped Israel Keyes into the man he would later become, but his upbringing would take an interesting turn later in his youth. At some point in his youth, Israel and his family relocated from the small town of Richmond, Utah, to an area just north of Colville, Washington. Many people don't realize this about Washington state, but it's a rather big state. Where most of the western side of the state encapsulates the view of Washington that you see in movies, aka the Starbucks, the flannel, the constant train, the trees, the eastern side is far different. Eastern Washington is comprised of many small towns, most of which are separated by many dozens or hundreds of miles. Eastern Washington has much more in common with nearby states Idaho or Montana than it does with Western Washington. The Cascade Mountains do a good job of not only helping hold off much of the rain that plagues the western half of the state, but they also stem most of the state's population. So it wasn't too much of a change when the Keyes family relocated to Eastern Washington. It wasn't too big of a jump from their origins in Utah, as the area they moved to, just north of Colville, encapsulates just as much of a small town feel as Richmond. Shortly after moving to this area of northeastern Washington state, the Keyes family began attending a church known as the Ark, and now more commonly referred to as Our Place Fellowship. The Ark has become well known throughout the area for its racist viewpoints, which are driven not only by the white supremacy viewpoints found in this area of Cascadia, but also by the strong religious roots in the British Israelism faith. The Ark was just one of many Christian identity religious movements that uprooted in the area. Many of the followers of the Ark, now followers of the Our Place Fellowship, believe that they, the descendants of Anglo-Saxons and other Northern European groups, are the true chosen people of God. Over the years, this has attracted many anti-Semitic people from the surrounding area and led to a lot of hostility towards those of other beliefs or races. We can only theorize how much this viewpoint affected Israel and sculpted his mindset, since we don't truly know how involved the Keyes family was in this church. But we can surmise that being raised in a culture that promotes hostility towards other ethnic groups and the glorification of oneself above all can't be good for an easily emboldened narcissistic mind. When the Keyes family moved to the Colville area, they became friendly with a neighboring family known as the Keyhoes. While at the time, this may have looked like two neighboring families in a small town community getting to know each other, a glimpse into the future can show us something much darker. Something much more sinister at play. Chivi Kehoe, a boy only 5 or so years older than Israel, was one of the boys that he grew up alongside and likely looked up to. A simple Wikipedia search can show you all you need to know about Chivi Kehoe and more. Chivi grew up to be a violent white supremacist and a serial criminal offender. Now serving 3 life sentences in a supermax federal prison, Chivi was convicted on charges of kidnapping, torture, and murder, among many others. His victims were a gun dealer, his wife, and their 8-year-old daughter, whom they all kidnapped, tortured, murdered, and disposed of their bodies in a swamp. Chivi's younger brother, Chane, wasn't involved in the murder of the 3 victims, but would later get involved with his brother's criminal antics. Chane was closer in age to Israel, and it reasons to think that the two of them were friends at one point in their lives. When the police eventually caught up with Chivi in Wilmington, Ohio in 1997, Chane was with him and the two engaged police officers in a shootout. Video of this incident can be found in multiple YouTube clips and was featured in many television cop shows. Chivi would go on to get life in prison without the possibility in parole for his heinous crimes, but his white supremacist viewpoints have never faltered. He was also found guilty of other crimes, ranging from bombing a city hall in Spokane, Washington, to ordering the murder of romantic rival. Needless to say, his despicable reputation is well-deserved. His younger brother Chane and his father Kirby were later arrested in Arizona for illegally stockpiling weapons and ammunition to carry out some ethnocentric anti-government goals. As you can see, the mindset of the people that were attracted to the hyper-religious art community were a bit off. While this is painting with a broad brush, it's easy to see the type of hateful fervor that the Keyes family raised their children alongside. While Israel would go on to eschew religion later in life, it's possible that some of these ideas helped shape his mind into what it would later become. He would grow up to become incredibly narcissistic, intelligent, methodical, and excited by the idea of violence. Israel Keyes was unstable as a youth, to say the least. He was excited by the idea of violence, and over time, he became enamored with the idea of inflicting pain on others. He admitted, later on in life, that he would torture animals like cats for fun, and he had his own myriad of emotional and mental issues. But all of the theories about his origins can possibly be traced back to the murder of a 12-year-old girl just outside of Colville, Washington. Julie Harris was a 12-year-old girl, a double amputee that had become a Special Olympics champion. She, of course, lived in Colville, the small town that the Keyes family lived just outside of. Sometime in 1996, little Julie Harris went missing, and many suspected that she had run away from home, according to reports from her mother's live-in boyfriend. Her prosthetic legs would later be found nearby a riverbed, which turned the investigation from her disappearance to her murder. While many have long suspected her mother's volatile boyfriend to be the main suspect, the proximity to Keyes and his origins can't be overlooked. It was around this time that Israel came of age and left the Colville area behind. No one is sure when Israel began exhibiting violent tendencies, but over the years, he started to become enamored with stories of serial killers. His idol, by his own admission, was the infamous serial killer Ted Bundy. Israel admired Bundy's tenacity to kill and his desire to inflict pain on others. No one is sure when this violent admiration began, but it undoubtedly helped inspire Israel Keyes to create his own modus operandi for crime. When he was 17, Israel moved east for a short period of time. We can't be sure whether he moved there with family or by himself, but he did admit to living in New York State for a few months in 1997 or so. He would later go on to own a large tract of land in upstate New York, just outside the town of Constable. Little is known of when or how he acquired this land, but it becomes relevant later on. At around the time he was 18, Israel moved again and entered another part of the Pacific Northwest. He moved to an area nearby Maupin, Oregon, an area well-renowned for its outdoor activities. 2 hours east of Portland, Maupin has a population of just a few hundred and again, is considered a very small town by almost every single metric. This is where the mystery of Israel Keyes begins. In either the summer of 1997 or 1998, a group of teenagers were inner tubing along the nearby Deschutes River. In an area where temperatures often exceed 100 degrees during the summer, this is to be an expected activity for a group of bored and easily excited teens. But for one unknown teenager, this day would become a nightmare. At some time in the late afternoon and early evening of a late summer day, Israel Keyes must have spotted these teenagers and taken note. He patiently waited for one of the teenagers, a young girl between the age of 14 and 18, to become separated from the group. According to his later testimony, Israel Keyes abducted this lone girl and led her away from the rest of her group. He would go on to sexually assault this poor girl before eventually letting her go and eventually making his getaway. The identity of this girl has never been found because she never came forward to police. Whether this was a made-up story created in Israel Keys's mind is anyone's guess, but this is the first crime Keys recalled committing. Following his stint living in Oregon, Israel Keys enlisted in the United States Army. During his time in the U.S. Army, he reached the rank of specialist and was given 3 different duty stations: Fort Hood, in Texas, somewhere overseas in Egypt, and Fort Lewis, located in western Washington. He spent a large chunk of his enlistment in Fort Lewis, located nearby Tacoma, Washington, a major part of the well-populated Seattle area. One of the things that is noticeably different about Keys is that he never wanted the renown that his idol, Ted Bundy, received. While most serial offenders commit their crime to gain some type of reputation, Keys shied away from the spotlight and never wanted his name to become associated with the crimes he would later commit. Keys would never confess to any crimes during his enlistment. He claims that he would go on to later commit multiple crimes following his honorable discharge in 2001, but he never admitted to committing a single crime while enlisted. Following his discharge from the United States Army in 2001, Israel Keys would move to Nebe, a small community right on the northwestern tip of Washington state. Nebe is a small fishing community right on the edge of Washington state. Right across the bay lays Vancouver Island, leaving it right at the border between the continental United States and Canada. Comprised of a predominant Native American population, Israel Keys would have stuck out like a sore thumb, but he soon found himself becoming a productive citizen of Nebe. In this small town of 800 or so people, Keys began to work for the Makah tribe as a landscaper, a construction worker, a handyman, just about everything a jack of all trades could be expected to be. Many of his fellow Nebe residents never recalled anything suspicious about him, seeing him as just another capable member of society that they could count on to fix just about anything, and who seemed to be a likable guy that everyone remembered as having a good sense of humor. Shortly after moving to Nebe, Israel had himself a girlfriend, a great role in society, and shortly afterwards, a daughter. While being a father didn't deter Israel Keys from committing any of his future heinous crimes, it did deter him from targeting children. He would later go on to make it a point to target victims that didn't have any children present, which we can surmise as being part of his criminal code. Keys would go on to admit murdering his first victim at some point between July and October of 2001. We do not know the identity or location of this victim, but this is when the FBI believes Israel Keys began his killing spree. Keys would admit to killing one victim in the second half of 2001, but the next few years are almost a total mystery. Not only to the people that knew Keys, but the FBI investigators that have spent months and years trying to retrace his footsteps. This is the time frame where Keys became a serial offender. Before this era, he had committed rather spontaneous crimes, but this is when Keys began to focus in on his MO, specifying it to the point of procedure. Sometime between 2001 and 2005, Keys killed a couple in Washington state, but he would refuse to give up any details. We don't know whether this was a married couple, a couple of young lovers, a family pairing, siblings, friends. Keys would later be rather scarce in giving out details, and all we know is that in the 4 years following his first murder he killed again. Investigators couldn't even be sure that the couple were Washington state residents or whether he had abducted them and driven them into Washington. Their identities have never been discovered, and there is no evidence that Keys committed these murders other than his word. In the interviews that Keys would give investigators, he would imply that this couple was buried in or nearby a valley. Investigators also surmised, based on his later crimes, that he had taken the car belonging to the couple and driven it a good distance away from the crime scene to separate the two and make their bodies almost unrecoverable. Keys would go on to admit, years later, that his main way of finding victims was to let them come to him. He would prefer to find them in public parks, campsites, hiking trails, the sort of places where people might naturally go missing. We have no way of knowing if this first couple was a married couple that he had singled out ahead of time, or if they were an unlucky pair of outdoorsmen that had stumbled upon this unlucky fate. In 2005 and 2006, Keys continued his killing spree, committing 2 more murders that were totally independent of one another. Again, these are crimes in which we don't know who the victims are or how he even got them in his sights. He would later confess to both of these crimes to investigators, but wouldn't reveal the names or even the slightest hints of identity for either set of victims. We don't know how many victims he may have piled up in this time frame, as he self-admittedly liked to strike in the summer and fall months, when tourism to Washington state is at its highest. Keyes would admit that he used his own boat to dispose of these victims, but would only admit where one of the bodies had been submerged, deep beneath the surface of Crescent Lake, right on the border of the scenic Olympic National Park, and just an hour east of his home in Knee Bay. He lightly poked at the notion that the bodies were submerged under hundreds of feet, as deep as the lake itself can get, but no bodies have been recovered from Crescent Lake up until now. We can't tell whether this is a story fabrication of Keyes or a self-assured testimony of his evil, but Keyes wasn't the sort of criminal who liked his misdeeds to be well known. It's likely that Keyes created these stories to simply gain renown, but it's much more likely that these crimes were just the tip of the iceberg for him. He was just getting started. In the first week of March 2007, Israel Keyes relocated yet again. We don't know what led to him leaving the close-knit community of Knee Bay, but he began driving north up towards Alaska. Along the way, he made multiple stops in many towns along the Alaska-Canadian Highway. He most notably made stops to towns in British Columbia and Yukon, although we don't know the extent of these stops. We would later learn that Keyes used every opportunity to his advantage, so he may have done some scouting or planning while visiting these towns. He eventually arrived in Anchorage on March 9, over a week after beginning his move north. He began to establish a new home in this northernmost state. In Anchorage, he established a business for himself, named Keyes Construction. He began to use his talents as a tradesman to cement himself as a normal guy to the citizens in his new northern home. In October and November of 2008, Keyes traveled from Alaska to a handful of states, including North Dakota, Arizona, and Washington. We don't know where he traveled to or what he was up to during these trips. We only know the barest of details, and even then, those are scarce. Keyes rented a car in Seattle on October 31, 2008, the car being a PT Cruiser. Where he traveled with this vehicle is anyone's guess. On November 2, 3 days after renting a car in Seattle, Keyes flew out of SeaTac Airport, headed for Boston, where he would stay for a total of 3 days. Needless to say, his activities during this time period are lost in time. Israel Keyes was a methodical planner, and this is logically where his plans began to plant themselves in the ground, almost literally. One of the most terrifying aspects about Israel Keyes is that he planned his actions months and years in advance. He would stake a claim on a future victim, entirely at random, and plan on attacking them years before doing so. It is incredibly likely that on this voyage east, Israel began to experiment with what would later be known as his murder kits. These kits would include weapons, money, tools, and other supplies needed to murder his victims and dispose of their bodies. Keyes would begin burying these murder kits all around the United States, in seemingly random areas close to the future victims. He would keep no record of what was contained in these kits and would bury them with the location only stored inside his mind, to be repossessed later on when he enacted his crimes. So on November 5, 3 days after visiting Boston with no real motive or purpose, he returned to Seattle and then Anchorage. It's likely that he began plotting out future murders years in advance and had buried a murder kit or two during this little vacation of his. Israel Keyes was now in his 30s, a single man who had begun to totally eschew religion from his life. At this point, Keyes was now a devout atheist, abandoning the religious upbringing he had been given and treading his own, dark philosophical path. Much like his idol, Ted Bundy, Keyes began to abuse alcohol. He also began to frequent prostitutes. For all of his narcissistic tendencies, Keyes was a man of many faults. In one life, he was the witty, loving father who worked hard in his day job, was a United States Army veteran, and who traveled the world constantly. He even came from a large religious family, which may have bolstered the image he had created. But underneath this facade was a man that was broken and shielded to everyone except for himself and his victims. This was a man who didn't believe in any higher power, who abused alcohol, who frequented women he'd likely look down upon, who enjoyed inflicting pain upon others. This was a part of himself that he didn't want known, as he had seen what had happened to his idol, Ted Bundy, and the scrutiny that his life had received under the microscope of the media. Keyes began to imagine a world where he inflicted pain on as many people as possible for his own enjoyment, and he didn't plan on seeing the ramifications of his actions. He had dreamed of going out in an epic gun battle with police, but he didn't want his living relatives to learn about his actions. Deborah Feldman was a woman at the end of her rope. She was approaching 50 and was the worse for wear. Deborah was addicted to many narcotics, and despite the best intentions of her adult son, Matthew, she wasn't getting any better. Deborah was addicted to heroin and cocaine, among other substances. Deborah lost custody of her only child, Matthew, when he was in his teenage years, and she seemed to spiral down from there. Even when she grew estranged from everyone in her life, she kept coming to her adult son for help financially, only to be rebuffed. In their last conversation, Deborah had come to visit Matthew and demanded that he give up the $400 he had just received as payment for his fast food job. She would go on and threaten to kill herself if her son didn't give up his paycheck to her, and he refused. At first, he offered her a nearby knife, calling her bluff. Deborah put down the knife and withdrew her threat. But then she broke down, telling her son that she needed the money to keep from getting evicted. Matthew eventually gave in to his mother's request and gave her the money. "That's what family does," he would later say. Deborah J. Feldman, a resident of New Jersey, would go missing just days afterwards. She was known by all in her life to have a serious issue with drugs and alcohol, and even her family wouldn't have been surprised to find out that she had likely been moonlighting as a prostitute before her disappearance. To this date, her fate and her whereabouts remain unknown, but her son hasn't forgotten about his missing mother. The FBI would later piece together the narrative that Israel Keyes abducted a woman in New Jersey, whom he later transported over to upstate New York, where she was murdered and buried. They do not believe that she was buried on his plot of land nearby Constable, but the likelihood of the body being buried nearby is high. They have linked this to the disappearance of Deborah Feldman, not only through happenstance, but by the near admission of Keyes. While being interrogated by the FBI, Keyes was shown photos of many of the missing men and women from the states he had visited, in the hopes that he would identify some, just to bring the families closure. He gestured no to most of the photos, but when he was shown a picture of Deborah Feldman, he paused. His response to the photo may be the only closure the family of Deborah Feldman will ever receive. "I'm not ready to talk about her," he would say, before dropping the subject forever. Just a day after the disappearance of Deborah Feldman, on April 10 of 2009, Keyes began to expand his criminal activities. Wearing a fake mustache, a fake goatee, sunglasses, and a hooded Carhartt jacket, he walked into a community bank with a silver handgun and demanded money. He got away with an undisclosed amount of money, and even though his picture was displayed across the local news and the town of Tupper Lake shut down all of the roads leading in and out of town, Keyes wasn't apprehended or even identified. Nobody in the area recognized him, since he was a complete outsider, and he hid out at a local campground until the heat had died down enough to make his getaway. Investigators would later find that this was just one of several bank robberies perpetrated by Keyes as a means of funding his constant expeditions around the United States. Little is known of how he got back to Anchorage, but it's likely that he may have driven the entire way and paid his way in cash so that no records would be maintained of his whereabouts. This would become an important aspect of his future travels, so it's possible that it started here. A year passed, but Keyes gave no sign of slowing down. On July 9, 2010, Keyes flew from Anchorage to Sacramento, California. He then traveled from Sacramento to Auburn, California, where he rented a vehicle, a black Ford Focus, and traveled close to 280 miles over the next few days. We can only guess to the extent of his activities in California, but it's likely that he may have buried another one of his murder kits or even committed a crime during his time there. In April or May of 2011, Keyes visited a park near Point Woronzof, located nearby his home city of Anchorage. He had a rifle with him and fully intended to shoot at a couple he had spotted in the parking lot of the park. When a police officer showed up in the parking lot, Keyes set his sights on the officer. He only refrained when a second officer was revealed to be there as well. Just weeks later, Keyes was stalking a nearby trailhead with the sole intention of abducting someone. He had even buried an improvised murder kit containing many bottles of Drano and a shovel, which he would use to dispose of his potential victim's body. He ended up coming up empty on both accounts, but his most well-known atrocities were yet to come. On June 2 of 2011, Israel Keyes flew out of Anchorage. His flight arrived in Chicago, but he had his sights set further east. He rented a car at the Chicago airport, which he then drove all the way east to Essex, Vermont. During this trip, he took the battery out of his cell phone so that there would be no trace of his travels, and he paid his entire way in cash. Money he had saved up from his handyman business, and also the money he had left over from the robberies he had committed. Years beforehand, during one of his many trips east, Keyes had buried one of his murder kits in the woods outside of a house. The house belonged to Bill and Lorraine Currier, an older couple that was adored by all that knew them. Bill and Lorraine Currier were longtime citizens of the area and had both been working their respective jobs for over 20 years. So when they were both absent from work the next morning, questions were asked and flags were raised. On the evening before, June 8, Keyes has broken into the house of Bill and Lorraine Currier and surprised the both of them. He had bound both and abducted them using their own vehicle to do so. He drove this terrified older couple to a nearby abandoned house where he led Bill into the basement. He kept Lorraine upstairs, where he began to sexually assault her, purely to cause pain. Bill began to struggle downstairs, and this loving husband tried to free himself to rescue his wife. Unfortunately, Keyes had come prepared for that, utilizing the murder kit he had buried years prior. He shot and killed Bill Currier and later strangled Lorraine to death. He took both of their bodies to the basement of the abandoned house, where he covered them in trash bags. He then poured Drano all over the two, hoping that the bodies would seriously decompose before anyone would find them. Israel Keyes covered them up with as much debris as possible to hide the bodies and simply left. Unfortunately, the bodies of Bill and Lorraine Currier were never found. The abandoned house they had been left in would later be demolished. The demolition crew noted that the basement smelled heavily of decomposition, but just assumed that the previous tenants had been hunters of some type, as hunting was very common in this area. The debris and the remains of the abandoned house were sent to a local landfill, and the only evidence proving that Bill and Lorraine Currier had been murdered was the testimony of a proven psychopath. In the week following the murder of Bill and Lorraine Currier, Israel Keyes traveled along the East Coast before returning to Chicago. In Chicago, he returned the rental car he had now driven thousands of miles in before flying to San Francisco. He would stay in the Bay Area for only a single night before flying back to Anchorage on June 16. He had been gone only 2 weeks, but the damage had been done. Bill and Lorraine Currier remain only 2 of 3 victims that can be absolutely attributed to Israel Keyes, with the third yet to come. Israel Keyes now had a taste for blood, and he was beginning to feel invincible. It was less than a year later that Israel Keyes would commit his most notorious act. He went against his usual MO and decided to strike close to home. Samantha Koenig was a beautiful 18-year-old woman with the rest of her life in front of her. She worked at a local coffee stand as a barista and was working the evening shift on this particular night. Surveillance footage can be seen of her working at the stand rather dutifully cleaning and tidying things up, as it was a rather slow Wednesday night on February 1. A man in a ski mask approaches the stand and asks Samantha to make him a coffee. You can see Samantha get to work on the coffee, but when she goes to hand it to him, he reveals a gun. He orders her to give him the money from the coffee stand, and then he enters the stand. He zip ties her hands and begins to lead her away from the coffee stand. This masked intruder reveals that he's going to abduct Samantha and extort her for ransom, but she tries to inform him that her family doesn't have much money. This masked man says that he's planning on the community raising the funds to get her back alive, and he orders her to follow his instructions. During this trip to his nearby truck, Samantha tries to make a break for it. Unfortunately, Keyes catches up and tackles her, putting a gun to her head and threatening to kill her with his quiet ammunition if she tries something like that again. Once Samantha Koenig was detained in his truck, Israel Keyes returned to the coffee stand to get Samantha's cell phone. He viewed her cell phone as a vital part of his plan, as he then used it to send 2 text messages, one to her boss and the other to her boyfriend. In this text message, he stated that Samantha had had a bad day at work and needed to get away for a few days. He took the phone with him, but removed the battery so that the police wouldn't be able to trace it to him. Despite the fact that he likely had plenty of money, Keyes demanded Samantha Koenig's debit card, which she informed him was in the truck that she shared with her boyfriend. Keyes drove Koenig to his home, where he locked her in an outdoor shed. He turned the radio up inside the shed so that her screams couldn't be heard by any possible neighbors. He threatened her multiple times, demanding to know where her debit card was and what the PIN for the account was. She told him, so he then left to go get her debit card. The truck that Samantha Koenig and her boyfriend shared was parked right outside their house, and Keyes attempted to break into it. This, or the previous text message, had alerted Koenig's boyfriend, who went out to confront this stranger. The two had a brief altercation, in which Keyes barely escaped, but the boyfriend went back inside to try and get help. In that time span, Keyes managed to grab the debit card and escape, all but sealing Samantha Koenig's fate. On the way back to his house, Keyes tested the debit card and found that it worked. He began to pull out Samantha Koenig's money and then traveled back home. There, he sexually assaulted Koenig before asphyxiating her. She was dead just hours after being abducted, but her family, friends, and loved ones wouldn't know of her fate for months. Early in the morning of the very next day, February 2nd, Israel Keyes departed for New Orleans. He left Koenig in the shed in his yard, assured that she wouldn't be disturbed in the time that he was gone. Keyes had pre-purchased a cruise leaving from New Orleans, which would take him out of the States for the next couple of weeks. This was apparently a regular occurrence for him, as he would take these small vacations, not only to spend the money from the victims he had murdered, but also to escape the heat of the crime for a short time. During this time, the Koenig family and Samantha's other loved ones began to grow desperate for any word. The only word they had received were those 2 text messages, followed by the intruder that had broken into her truck and stolen her debit card. They knew nothing and wouldn't until February 17th. On February 17th, Samantha Koenig's boyfriend received a text message from her phone informing her that there was a ransom note at a nearby park. Hidden under a lost dog flyer, the ransom note was found by Anchorage police and demanded $30,000 for the safe return of Koenig. On the opposite side of the ransom note was a photo of Koenig, taken just a day or so beforehand, posed to look like she was still alive. Keyes had sewn her eyelids open to make her look alive and placed a 4-day-old newspaper under her arm to appear lifelike. Believing his daughter was still alive, James Koenig began pleading to the community to raise money to save his little girl. The community did a great job of marshalling together to bring back one of their own and began to deposit the money into Samantha's account, which Keyes still had access to. Unfortunately, Samantha Koenig had been dead for nearly 2 weeks now, and Keyes was ready to get rid of the evidence. He began to dismember her body and drove it out to the frozen Matanuska Lake, where he had to cut holes in the surface of the lake to bury her body, piece by piece. Fortunately, this would be the last violent crime that Israel Keyes would ever commit. Police began to trace the withdrawals from Samantha Koenig's bank account to ATMs in Anchorage, Arizona, Texas, and New Mexico. Now the FBI was involved with the case, along with the Texas Rangers, and they quickly found that the person making the withdrawals was driving a white Ford Focus. On a chance encounter with a couple of Texas highway patrolmen, Keyes was identified as the person of interest in this now federal case before being pulled over and detained. I'm sure that these patrolmen that happened upon Keyes had no idea that they had detained one of the most methodical serial killers of recent times, but they were more than capable enough to not only detain Keyes peacefully, but to find Koenig's cell phone in the trunk of the car and later find her debit card in his wallet. Now police had the random killer of Samantha Koenig, but they had no idea what kind of intricate, mysterious web they had now stumbled upon. Israel Keyes was now behind bars, and he would later go on to admit to federal investigators that he was behind the mysterious disappearance of Bill and Lorraine Currier, who had seemingly vanished from the face of the planet a year or so prior. He would admit to many more crimes in his time behind bars, including the arson of a house in Texas on February 16, just a day before returning to Anchorage to demand ransom for Samantha Koenig. He also confessed to multiple bank robberies in that same Texas town and others in the state of New York, which he had never even been suspected in. He would go on to admit killing 8 or so people, but many have theorized that that number is on the lower end of the spectrum. With the crazy amount of trips he made throughout the country and even internationally, some have theorized Keyes to be involved with dozens of disappearances. He admitted to at least one killing where the body was recovered and hinted that police might have ruled the death an accident. Investigators leaned towards the notion that Keyes had murdered one of his victims and then started a house fire, but trying to find out exactly who this victim was without a confession would be downright impossible. Keyes told investigators that he buried his murder kits all over the United States, and to date, a handful have been found, but many more are likely still buried out there. Unfortunately, after months of interrogations and interviews with federal authorities, little information had been turned up. On December 2, 2012, just months after being detained for the murder of Samantha Koenig, Israel Keyes extracted a blade from a shaving razor that he used to slit his own wrist, just as he set up a series of sheets to hang himself with. Israel Keyes killed himself, taking his secrets to the grave and leaving behind a blood-stained suicide letter, which follows. We don't know all of the crimes Israel Keyes committed. He cowardly killed himself and took his secrets to the grave. Unfortunately, a mind as sharp and methodical as his was used for something so nefarious, so evil, that we'll likely never get to piece together the puzzle he left investigators. Right after his death, the FBI sent out a plea to the public, begging anyone with any information to come forward and help them fill in their gaps of knowledge. They released a handful of their interviews with Keyes, most of which consist of Keyes haggling with the investigators and dragging his feet in the mud. Keyes refused to give up much information of his crimes, so even the FBI doesn't know the true fate of his victims. Hell, they don't even know who his victims were. Keyes' surviving family members held a funeral for him in the chilly month of December of 2012, not forgiving him for any of his crimes and damning him to eternal torment. But, unlike his victims, his family got some semblance closure and know his ultimate fate. He leaves behind one daughter. Some people have theorized that the FBI reached an agreement with Keyes and limited the amount of information about his crimes in order to get some information. I'm not sure how I feel about this theory because it's been a matter of years now with no real developments, but the theory hinges on the idea that Keyes was an even bigger monster than the FBI has built him up to be. Unfortunately, we'll never know because this case is likely to never be solved.
Number 5.
Right after his death, the FBI sent out a plea to the public, begging anyone with any information to come forward and help them fill in their gaps of knowledge. They released a handful of their interviews with Keyes, most of which consist of Keyes haggling with the investigators and dragging his feet in the mud. Keyes refused to give up much information of his crimes, so even the FBI doesn't know the true fate of his victims. Hell, they don't even know who his victims were. Keyes' surviving family members held a funeral for him in the chilly month of December of 2012, not forgiving him for any of his crimes and damning him to eternal torment. But, unlike his victims, his family got some semblance closure and know his ultimate fate. He leaves behind one daughter. Some people have theorized that the FBI reached an agreement with Keyes and limited the amount of information about his crimes in order to get some information. I'm not sure how I feel about this theory because it's been a matter of years now with no real developments, but the theory hinges on the idea that Keyes was an even bigger monster than the FBI has built him up to be. Unfortunately, we'll never know because this case is likely to never be solved.
Number 6.
A father is still clinging to hope that police will find out who killed his daughter and her unborn baby. It's been 14 years since Jenna Nielsen was murdered, but he believes the case is still solvable. And that the murderer is still out there. Nielsen's father, Kevin Blaine, said he feels miffed 10 years on. I was hoping it would be solved quickly, I think like anyone else, but as the years have dragged by, still nothing, Blaine said. Nielsen moved to Raleigh, her husband and 2 kids. The 22-year-old was anxiously awaiting the arrival of Ethan, her 3rd child. She was one of those kids that was bubbly, life of the party, always wanted to be the center of attention. Cute. Great mother, Blaine said. And like a great young mother, she strived to provide for her little ones. Her husband worked during the day and she took a job delivering newspapers early in the morning. Never was there any worry about what she was doing, she never brought that to us at all, Blaine said. It was June 14, 2007 when Nielsen was on her route, but her family didn't hear from her. We assume she must have gone into labor, she's at a hospital, so we'll start making some phone calls. And it wasn't but 15 minutes after that I get a call from my son-in-law that says come to the house as fast as you can, I'll tell you when you get here, Blaine said. Of course when you pull up, there's a police car in the driveway, 2 guys in suits. Your heart just drops. It was exactly what Blaine feared. Someone murdered Nielsen just weeks before her due date. There were so many things going through my mind like, what happened? You can only assume the worst. And then the details, Blaine said. Her body was found behind a gas station at the intersection of Lake Wheeler Road and Centennial Parkway, one of the stops on her delivery route. Her car was still running, and her purse was still inside the vehicle. Detectives say while going back to her car, when someone sneaked up behind her and stabbed her in the throat. It was brutal, a brutal crime. An innocent woman doing her job, said Sergeant Matthew Free with Raleigh Police. Nielsen's murder baffled police. They searched high and low, found a lot of clues, but nothing has led to anyone, Blaine said. But there was a witness, a person who says they saw the man responsible, and police later released a sketch. Nielsen's family took the search nationwide, hoping the show America's Most Wanted would help. And a tip came through. They discovered somebody in Mississippi that matched everything, the timeline. Sketch, the whole bit, said Blaine. Detectives immediately flew out to question the man. They interviewed the guy back there and his alibis played out. He wasn't the right person, said Blaine. It was then back to square one. Every single lead starts to become a dead end, and that's why the case has gone for as long as it has. We just keep having to dig, Free said. Nielsen's husband eventually left Raleigh to raise their children. Neither are able to really remember the mother who worked so hard for them, or the brother they never met. I hold out hope. Sure. I'm never going to give up, Blaine said. After 10 years you start to wonder. Part of that hope comes from DNA evidence that police say they found at the scene. They won't give much detail on what that evidence is but say they think this case is solvable. If he never gets caught, he has to meet his maker someday and pay for what he's done, said Blaine. The tip line is still open and a $15,000 reward still waiting. There's no closure, there's always going to be a hole. I mean you have that part of your life that's taken away, Blaine said. You can't replace that. You can move on and deal with it. But there's always going to be that hole. Nielsen's murder did spark change. If the man who killed Nielsen was caught, they would have only been charged with her murder, not Ethan's. But her story led North Carolina lawmakers to pass the Unborn Victims of Violence Act in 2011, better known as Ethan's Law. It recognizes an unborn child as a second victim of a crime. Police called Jenna's death completely random. They have followed numerous leads in the case, but they have not been able to charge anyone for Jenna's murder. The lead detective on the case told reporters, every single lead starts to become a dead end, and that's why the case has gone for as long as it has. We just keep having to dig. The same detective also confirmed that they do have DNA evidence from the crime scene, and they think that it will one day help them solve the case. Still, over a decade has passed since Jenna's murder, and police do not appear to have any suspects. There is a $15,000 reward in place for anyone with information that could lead to the arrest of a suspect. If you have any information, that could help solve Jenna's case, please contact Crime Stoppers at 919-834-4357.
Number 7.
The murder of Keira Banks occurred in 2007. She was a 24-year-old nursing student at the time she was found unconscious in the doorway of her home in Seminole County, Florida. More than a decade has passed, and still, no arrests have been made in connection with Banks' death, leaving her case unsolved. At around 10 p.m. on November 16, 2007, deputies with the Seminole County Sheriff's Office were dispatched to a home in the 200 block of Stefanik Road in Winter Park after receiving a 911 call about a shooting, according to the Orlando Sentinel. When officers arrived on the scene, they encountered a woman lying unconscious in the doorway. She was later identified as Keira Banks, who appeared to have suffered from a gunshot wound. Police officials also discovered a 2-year-old girl, believed to be Banks' daughter, Neala Smith, inside the home. She was unharmed. Emergency first responders transported Banks to Orlando Regional Medical Center, where she succumbed to her injuries 2 days later around 12:30 p.m., according to the Seminole County Sheriff's Office. After questioning residents in the area, police learned from 2 witnesses that the shooting happened around 10:20 p.m. Shortly after, 3 or 4 black males were seen fleeing from Banks' home in a blue or green Crown Victoria or Grand Marquis. The vehicle may have had at least one hubcap missing. The victim's mother, Sylvonia Banks, told WCTV that they all loved her, and it's just having to get up and think about the other kids that I have. She added, and to certainly think about the things that they need to see in me, the encouragement, the strength to move forward, and to go on with their lives. Anyone with information regarding the unsolved murder of Keira Banks is encouraged to contact the Seminole County Sheriff's Office at 407-665-6600.